where I'm very pleased that Jaime Harker is here to teach our peace lesson. Jaime, we're so happy to have you with us on Beyond the Walls.
When I first started studying the history of the Community of Christ, I became very interested in the church's missions to Utah in the 1860s, when Joseph Smith III and his brothers denounced Utah polygamy and condemned the LDS Church for ascribing the practice to Joseph Smith. When I was growing up in an LDS congregation, I felt a similar outrage about the practice of polygamy. The Community of Christ's clear rejection of polygamy and its ordination of women to the priesthood first led me to investigate the church. I appreciated the bravery and the fiery rhetoric of these early anti-polygamy missionaries, even as I recognized that their claim that Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith, initiated the practice was wrong. Recently, though, when reading Valine Tippett Avery's biography of David Hiram Smith, I noticed something else: the self-righteous accusations of adultery and immorality which those on each side of the divide threw at each other. My horror of polygamy stemmed from its abuse of power, its misogyny, and the terrible price it inflicted on women in the practice, many of whom had been pressured and bullied into the institution. But back in the 19th century, the conversation about polygamy centered on what we today might call slut-shaming. The nasty relish Mormons took in recounting the infidelity of Emma Smith's second husband, Louis Bideman, always troubles me. But I can also understand what polygamous wives in particular must have felt when Emma and her sons condemned them for immorality, when most of those women would never have considered entering into plural marriages had they not been commanded to do so by Joseph Smith and his leadership team. It must have felt satisfying to those polygamous wives to be able to throw back charges of immorality and adultery against Emma, while justifying their own behavior as righteous. Similarly, Emma's refusal to admit Joseph Smith's central role in creating polygamy is understandable when one considers the significant trauma she suffered. Her husband, to whom she had given everything, betrayed her and pressured her to accept what to her was unacceptable. Her own friends married her husband behind her back, and when her husband was brutally murdered, she was threatened and isolated by her own community for her rejection of polygamy and Brigham Young's specious authority. Emma had many reasons not to tell her sons and the church at large the truth about polygamy, but I think the central reason was shame. She was ashamed of her own attempts to placate her husband and save her marriage, ashamed of her own complicity, however reluctant, in a practice that horrified her and broke her heart. When she stayed behind in Nauvoo, I think she put all those parts of the Restoration tradition that were most traumatic into a box, so to speak, and tried to forget it. I think she hoped all of that would stay buried forever. But her oldest son eventually became convinced of his prophetic status and led the reorganization partly to clear his father's name. She could not bring herself to open up that box and come to terms with what had really happened. Instead of facing her own shame, she projected that shame onto the former friends who left her behind and accepted the unacceptable. And the church her oldest son led did the same, projecting all of Joseph Smith's mistakes and excesses onto the Brighamites, secure in their own righteous superiority, a superiority based upon a lie. I understand that impulse. Shame is a destructive force. I spent my childhood surrounded by those who wanted to fill me with shame about who I am and who I love, who equated purity culture with spirituality, and who policed and punished sexual transgression in the most invasive and hurtful ways imaginable. When we condemn others for sexual transgression, whether for promiscuity or polygamy or homosexuality, we indulge in a destructive self-righteousness that produces shame in those we denounce. This sort of pious self-righteousness is destructive to everyone, most particularly to those who wield it. We judge others to avoid the shame we have internalized. We cannot project that internal shame onto others without hurting ourselves in the process. And we cannot prevaricate or sidestep the slut-shaming tendency that runs so deep in our Restoration tradition. Compared to the LDS tradition in which I was raised, where simply being a member of the LGBTQ+ community is enough to warrant excommunication, the Community of Christ is light years ahead. There are no worthiness interviews, no excommunication for homosexuality, no denunciations from the pulpit. In 2013, the Community of Christ made a great step forward when it opened the priesthood to LGBTQ plus members. But we have stalled on the way to full inclusion. That 2013 document still circulates stereotypes about promiscuity in the gay community. It still foregrounds marriage as the only valid expression of sexuality, and it still encourages the idea that sexual surveillance is appropriate in a religious community. The interim rules that allow for queer ordination in a few parts of the world have not been formally adopted, and in many other places, even that interim acceptance has been delayed in the name of cultural diversity. In the meantime, the LGBTQ plus community continues to be framed as criminals, prosecuted and imprisoned and executed. As a religious body that proclaims the worth of all persons and claims reducing needless suffering as a core principle, the Community of Christ's dithering and avoidance have been shameful. True peace cannot exist when people are being persecuted for who they are, when any human being is deemed illegal. We as a religious body are not drawing closer to Christ, the peaceful one, when we refuse to take a stand for full inclusion of LGBTQ plus people everywhere. It is beyond time, as Harmony reminds us, to finish this sacred work. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 162, our obligations to our neighbors was made clear. From the earliest days, you have been given a sacred principle that declares the inestimable worth of all persons. Do not forget. A prophetic people must work tirelessly to tear down walls of separation and to build bridges of understanding. You hold precious lives in your hands. Be gentle and gracious with one another. A community is no stronger than the weakest within it. Even the one you follow reached out to those who were rejected and marginalized. So must the community that bears his name. Full queer inclusion now. Our religious tradition demands no less. Amen.